Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Today we're finishing the Geonic period, right? The Geonic era. That's the era after the publication of the Talmud. I repeat, the Geonim were the same Rashi Yeshivot of the same yeshivot where they published the Talmud, where the Kalam months used to take place. Just this is after the publication of the Talmud. And we saw that during the time of the publication of the Talmud, it was relatively peaceful time during those 60-year reign of Ravina and Rav Asher, really more Rav Asher. At the end of that time, it was already becoming a more hectic. The persecution of the Jewish people was intensifying, and that's when the Talmud was finally published. Later on, the world was thrown into more wars between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, and that became a lot more difficult, or it posed a lot more of an obstacle for the Jewish communities around the world to come to the yeshivot in Bavel for the Yerchei Kala. All right, and then we saw that the status of all the courts post Talmudic, post publication of the Talmud, they had a more local jurisdiction, and no court anymore from that time onwards until today. No court has we call it a general authority over the entire Jewish community. The only thing that is legally binding from that day on, post-Talmudic era, is only what was decided in the Talmud. And as long as you can prove that your opinion is based on the Talmud, it doesn't matter if you were born yesterday or 1,000 years ago. If you can prove your point that your logic fits in with the Talmud, that your Pisak Halacha is better founded in the Talmud than a different opinion, then everyone needs to follow that. Whatever makes most sense, more Talmudic sense. Okay, so now we're going to finish with the era of the Geonim. We'll speak about one of the last Geonim, Rav Shirira Gaon, who was the author of the letter that we've been studying throughout this course. Right, one of the four sources I brought was the letter of Rav Shirira Gaon, and his son Rav Haye Gaon, who was the last of the Geonim. All right. So ve'acharav, talking about after Rav Saadia Gaon, there's a story here. I think I'm not going to get into it. But after Rav Saadia Gaon, who by the way was also one of the greatest of the Geonim, he wrote tremendous books and letters and responses and commentaries to the entire Tanakh, and translated the entire Tanakh. And he has books specifically on the book of Iyov, of Job, and books on Kohen, on the writings of Shlomo HaMelech. And he has fantastic works, and he also has a book on Jewish philosophy called the Emunot Videot. Right, that is Rav Saadia Gaon. He's also one of the later Geonim, and the one after him, Rav Shirira Gaon. He'erich Yamin, right? He had a very long life, Rav Shirira Gaon. Ki kemo 100 shanim hayu yemeh shnei hayav. He lived about 100 years. וכשראה שאריך ימים ובנו רב היה ראוי להיות ראש ישיבה, סילק עצמו וישב בנו על כיסאו. Right, when he saw that he's already getting old, he's already an old man, and his son is wise and worthy of being the president of the court himself, he says, I'm going to remove myself from the position of being president, and I'll appoint my son instead of me. Right? So he had he had some degree of humbleness. Today sometimes you see some rabbis, they live to the year of 100, and till the day that they die, they still head their yeshiva, and that does sometimes cause problems. We saw recently, during Corona, that there was a very famous Rav Kanievsky who passed away. We actually see his not his son, his son-in-law is kind of like manipulating him in his old age. So Rav Sherira Gaon, he had the wisdom, and he was also humble enough to realize that he's getting old, and his son, who is worthy of being Gaon, could take his place. So he removed himself from that office, from that position, and his son took his place. V'hu Rav Haye Gaon. And the Rav Haye Gaon also, there's many letters and many responses, questions that were sent to the Geonim, questions that were sent to Rav Haye Gaon, and his responses are also gathered. And we have books on the responses of Rav Haye Gaon. Bar Rav Sherira Gaon, the son of Rav Sherira Gaon, who was the son of Bar Rav Hanania Gaon. Right? So we're talking about, there's a whole Sholshelet, there's a whole chain of tradition of Geonim that they were part of. Rav Haye Gaon, the son of Rav Sherira Gaon, who was the son of Rav Hanania Gaon, who was the son of Rav Yehuda Gaon, right? V'hu hirbis Torah be'Yisrael yeter mikol Geonim, right? And he spread out Torah, he taught Torah throughout the nation more than any of the previous Geonim, throughout the entire era of the Geonim. Ul'oro halchu dorshei haTorah mimizrach shemesh ad meba'o, right? And everyone followed in his path, and he enlightened the Jewish communities throughout the entire world. And he lived 69 years. And he passed away when Niftar be'erev Yom Tov Haron shel Pesach, right in the eve of the last day of Pesach, Shevi'i shel Pesach, Shnat Elef, Shana 355, L'shtarot. All right, okay, so that's the year Daled Anafim Tashtzach. That's 798, right? 4,000. That's 4,798 to the creation of the world. וכמהו לא היה לפניו בגאונים, והוא היה סוף הגאונים. Right, and there was no other Gaon as great as Rav Haye Gaon. He was the greatest of them, and he was the last of the Geonim. Right, so the Yehuda HaNasi, he was the end of the Tanaim with the publication of the Mishnah. And then we have Rav Asher, Ravina and Rav Asher, they were the end of the Amoraim with the publication of the Talmud. After that, there are no more binding publications. And then we reach, this is the era of the Geonim. The last of the Geonim is Rav Haye Gaon, who was one of the greatest of all the Geonim, and he was the last of the Geonim. Umibet David Haya Mizera HaMelucha. He was also descendant of King David. So he is from the royal seed. And this was very important for the Jewish people to still maintain one of the key offices, to still be linked to the seed of King David, the lineage of King David, right? So at this time, if you remember, there are two main offices. One is the head of the yeshiva, the president of the yeshiva, the president of the court, and there's also the Rosh Galut, the head of the diaspora. The Rosh Galut is a more political position, and the head of the yeshiva is a more, call it a legal leadership, or legal / spiritual leadership of the people. Okay? Now, really, the Rosh Galut, the head of the diaspora, is a political position, and that's the one where you would think is more important to maintain it being linked to the lineage of King David, because it's a political leadership. And usually it was. However, as a political position, political leadership needs to be recognized not just by the Jewish people, but also by the political establishment at that time. So if they're under Persian rule, it needs to be recognized by the Persian Empire. And if they're under Roman rule, it needs to be recognized by the Roman Empire. And at this time already, it's no longer Persian rule or Roman rule. They're now under the Muslim rule. And it needs to be recognized by the Muslim leadership or the Muslim Empire. And as with any political position, you're able to easily corrupt it. Because if you want to be recognized by the king of Babel, then I don't know, if you're very rich and you have a lot of influence, you could just buy the position. And that's something that happened often. And so it wasn't always possible to make sure that the head of the diaspora, the political leadership, was always necessarily linked to the lineage of King David. So what they tried to do, at least since there was no real influence, or we'll call it external influence, on who is appointed as head of the court, they tried to, as much as possible, appoint someone worthy who was also descendant of King David. So at least if the political leadership isn't from King David's lineage, then at least the spiritual or slash the legal, the judicial leadership will be linked to the lineage of King David. All right, so this lineage of the Geonim, right, ending with Rav Haye Gaon, the son of Rav Shirira Gaon, right, the son of Rav Hanania Gaon, right, all the way back to Rav Yehuda Gaon. These were all from the lineage of King David, Umizera HaMelucha, right? They were from the royal family, Umibnei Zerubbabel ben Shealtiel, right? Specifically from the lineage of Zerubbabel ben Shealtiel. If you remember, Zerubbabel was in the times of Ezra, right? Even previous to Ezra, times of Ezra Sofer. V'nesiim, right, and the presidents, v'rashei galuyot shayu acharav, right? So from their lineage, there's also their descendants of heads of the diaspora as well, since they were usually appointed from that royal family. V'ra'iti hotamo shehaya hatum al gilionam. And I saw his stamp. He's giving witness to the stamp of Rav Haye Gaon. He saw letters sent to Rav Haye Gaon, and letters that Rav Haye Gaon responded, and they were stamped with his seal, right, on his letters. Shaya Sholeach ve'aryeh היה חקוק עליו כמו שהיה על דגל מחנה יהודה ודגלי מלכי יהודה. And his seal, his stamp, was like a royal seal. It was the shape of a lion, same as, the emblem of the kings of Judah. אבל מימי ישמעאלים לא נהגו ראשי גלויות שררה כהוגן, אלא היו קונים אותה בממון רב. So now he's explaining what I explained before. Why was it important for there to be a Gaon, a Rosh Yeshiva, who is also from the seed of King David, is because during the times of the Muslims, right, that the position of the head of the diaspora was corrupt, and whoever could offer the Muslim ruler at the time more money would buy the position from him. והיו קונים אותה בממון רב. And it wasn't necessarily someone who was, never mind from the lineage of King David, he may have not have been worthy at all to be in that position. He just wanted the political power. היו קונים אותה בממון רב מן הישמעאלים. They'd buy it from the Muslims, at the highest price. כמו מוכסים, והיו רועלים, ולא רצו הוריו להיות ראשי גלויות. Right, and his parents, the parents of his ancestors of Rav Gaon, they didn't want to be in that office of head of the diaspora because it was a corrupted office, and they didn't want to be appointed to a corrupted office. So they preferred to be heads of the court because they were worthy of being heads of the Supreme Court as well. And so they returned to the office of the Geonut, the head of the yeshiva. And he's from the descendant of Rabbi, who we saw previously at the times of the Amoraim. Right, and they were how do you call it? Hilshinu, no, what's the word? I'm forgetting my English. Other Jews who were jealous of them, right, of their position, they went and they ratted them to the authorities. They complained about them to throw them into jail. V'tafsam hamelech Ishmael, and they were caught and arrested by order of the king. Ubazu kol asher lahem, and they looted all of their properties and all of their assets. Velo hishir lahem shum mihya ba'olam, and they didn't leave them anything to live on. And v'nitla Rav Shirira biyado ahat v'hu keben mea shana, right? And around the age of 100 years, Rav Shirira was killed by the Muslim king. Velo husar migionut, right? He never was removed from his office. He was succeeded by his son, right? Uvishnan daled alafim, and in the year 4728, Ayarav Shirira Gaon. This is when he was appointed to be Gaon, and he was Gaon for 30 years, and then he was succeeded by his son in the year 4758, right? Hayarav Hayele Gaon. Right, so 30 years and another 40 years his son was gone. It was a total of 70 years of Rav Shirira and his son Rav Haye Gaon. And then Rav Shirira was killed, and Rav Haye actually he ended up fleeing Bavel and moving on. I think he went to Spain. Bnei Yeshivot, Rav Haye Gaon, Hekimo, Hizkiya Rosh Galut, Ben Beno Shel David ben Zakai. All right, so in the times of Rav Haye, they appointed a new Rosh Galut. This new Rosh Galut, head of the diaspora, was Hizkiya, and he was the grandson of David ben Zakai, who was the previous Rosh Galut. He was a corrupted Rosh Galut. David ben Zakai was a corrupted Rosh Galut. He had a fallout with the Gaon at the time. Rav Saadia Gaon actually went into hiding because David ben Zakai wanted to kill him. Eventually, they made peace, and now this next generation, it's actually 2 generations later, we have Rav Haye Gaon, right, who's the 3rd Gaon after Rav Saadia Gaon, and the grandson of that David ben Zakai is Hizkiya. He is now appointed as the head of the diaspora. So he succeeded this Hizkiya, who was the Rosh Galut. He succeeded Rav Haye Gaon after he finished his office, finished his term, and fled. Ve'od shenatayim, right? And he was there for another 2 years. Ve'elshinu bo el melech Ishmael malshinim. right, for another 2 years. And then the same thing happened to him with Rav Hayegon, where he was reported upon to the Muslim authorities to kick him out. And he caught him and he arrested him, and he tortured him, and he didn't leave anything left for him. לרב יוסף הלוי הנגיד ברב שמואל הנגיד שהיה אוהב לחזקיהו ראש גלות. Right, and his two sons of Hizkiyahu, who was the new Gaon and head of the diaspora, his two sons, after their father was caught and tortured and most likely about to be killed, they fled Bavel and they went to Spain. They went to Spain, specifically they went to seek the help of Rav Yosef Halevi Hanagid. Hanagid is kind of like the title of Rosh Galut. From this time forward, we no longer refer to the political leadership of the Jewish people as Rosh Galut, but as Hanagid. And he was the son of Rav Shemuel Hanagid. Anybody ever hear that name, Rav Shemuel Hanagid? Rav Shemuel Hanagid, we're going to see stories about him soon as well. He was a very prominent figure in early Spain. And his son, who succeeded him, was also, and by the way, even how do you call it? The Rambam, while we never refer to Maimonides as Hanagid, he was referred to, he also had the title of Rais al-Yahud, right? The head of the Jews. Meaning even Rambam, by the way, his sons, his descendants afterwards are referred to as Rabbi Yehoshua Hanagid, because they were also considered to be political leadership of the Jewish people. Rais al-Yahud is in Arabic, it means the head of the Jews. By the way, the Rambam, it's also accepted that he was also, although we don't have it's not specified in any source, but it is thought that he is also a descendant of King David as well. So he's also from the royal family. So he fled to Spain. The two sons of Hizkiah Rosh Galut, they fled to Spain to the house of Rav Yosef HaLevi HaNagid, the son of Rabbi Shemuel HaNagid. Rabbi Shemuel HaNagid, he was also a great scholar. He was extremely rich. He was eventually he was also appointed as the general of the Spanish army under the Spanish ruler. We're talking about Muslim Spain, right? This is about roughly 950, 1,000 years ago. I'd say more about 1,000 years ago. He started from very little, almost nothing, and grew to become the king's most trusted advisor and general of the military. So when the two sons of Hizkiah fled Bavel, they went to Rav Yosef HaNagid because they were very close. You know, they were always in contact. Even though they're in Bavel, they're the Jewish leadership in Bavel. They're always in contact with the Jewish leadership in Spain. And this is a time where Spanish Jewry is on the rise, and Babylonian Jewry is dwindling, and eventually Spain becomes the new capital of the Jewish people. So he was close with this Hizkiah, head of the Galut, וראש ישיבה, והיה עמו עד שהיה הגזרה בגרנטה, ונהרג רב יוסף הנגיד. Right, and they were with him until there was a persecution in Spain, in Granada, and this Rav Yosef HaNagid was eventually also killed and murdered in this persecution. And we'll read more about that later. This is a bridge period between the end of the Geonim and the beginning of what is referred to as the Rabbanut, right? So this era on, from even Rav Shemuel HaNagid and Rav Yosef HaNagid, is already the beginning of the Rishonim. And so here we're going to move into a new era. We're finished with the era of the Geonim. The last of the Geonim is Rav Haye Gaon. This is already a time that's becoming problematic for the Jewish people in Bavel. In the meantime, the Jewish communities in Spain are starting their golden era. So this is the story of Rav Shemuel HaNagid, who we mentioned before. So Rav Shemuel HaLevi, right? He was a Levite. HaNagid, he was the head of the Jews, the son of Rabbi Yosef, Yadua ben Gitkilia, Mikahal Cordova, right? So they come from Cordoba, Spain. Anyone familiar with that city in Spain? Cordoba? That's the city that the Rambam was born in. And that's where the big yeshiva of Spain was, in Cordoba. So Rav Shemuel HaNagid was from Cordoba. Hayat Talmid Hacham Maskinim HaGedonim. He was one of the great Hachamim. He was very, very learned. ועוד היה בקיא בספרי הישמעאלים ובלשונם. And he was also very fluent in all the writings, the texts of the Muslims at the time, right? This is a time where the Muslims were in their golden age. They had tremendous philosophers, they had mathematicians, they had many scientists, right? So they had a very rich culture at that time. And Rabbi Shemuel HaNagid, he was a very great scholar, not just in Jewish studies, but also in Muslim studies, or general studies, we'll call it, which most of it was written at that time in Arabic. Same way that most scientific journals today and all scientific writings today are published in English. Back then, everything was published in Arabic. And he also had a certain strength to his character, where he's able to stand before the king, and he's able to serve the king of Spain. והיה רוכל מפרנס את עצמו בצער עד שהיו ימי חירום בספרד לאחר שנפסקה מלכות בן אבי עמר. Right, and this is in times of the rule of this Muslim family, Ben Abi Amar. At that time, he was a poor merchant in Spain. He had a very hard time making a living until the end of this reign in Spain, and this other one started in its place. Right, and the city of Cordoba was conquered by this other Arab army that's coming, and the people of Cordoba fled. יש מי שברח לסרקוסטה ועוד זרעם שם עד היום. So some of them fled to Saracosta, and you could still see them there today. This, we're talking about just a few generations after Rabbi Shemuel HaNagid. ויש מי שברח לטוליטולה וזרעם ניכר שם עד היום. Some of them went to Saracosta, and some of them went to Tolitula. And Rabbi Shemuel, he ran away to Maluka. I think that's Malaga today of Spain. All right, and he had a store, he had a shop, and he would sell in the shop. And and his store was close to the court of one of the king's advisors, Havus ben Mahes Melech Pelishtim beGranata. Right, so they're in Malaga. They're in Malaga, and in Granada, right? That's the capital, the Muslim capital of Spain. That's where the king is. That's where the king's court is, and his advisor lives in Granada. And he spends in Malaga. He spends most of his time with the king, but every once in a while he goes home. Right, and his maiden, the maiden of this advisor, she would come to his shop a lot, and she would buy books from Rabbi Shimon Hanagid. We also know, by the way, Rabbi Shimon Hanagid, we have not just his Hebrew books, his Hebrew writings, but he was an amazing poet. Till today, his poetry is studied in high school here in Israeli high schools. By the way, this is an era where most of our greatest poets came from. Talk about Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, right? Ibn Gevirol. You see, you walk around Tel Aviv, you see their names everywhere. Ibn Gevirol, Yehuda Halevi, Ibn Ezra. There were all these fantastic poets. Rabbi Shimon Hanagid as well. They were fantastic poets, tremendous books on poetry. You could do the math. The amount of poems they wrote comes out to maybe, it seems as if they wrote 10 poems a day, every day of their life. But he would also write books. וכותב ספרים לאדוני המשנה אבו אלקאס בן אל-ערוף. All right, so she would buy books from him, and she would send them to her master, who was the advisor, the king's advisor. And he would see his books, and he would read the books of Rabbi Shimon Hanagid, and he was astonished by his wisdom. ולכס ימים נשאל מלפני משנה זה בן אל-ערוף ממלכו חבוס לשוב לביתו למלכה. And eventually, he took leave and he went back to his house, to Malaka. ושאל את אנשי ביתו, מי היה כותב לכם הספרים הבאים האלה? Says, who is the author of these books? Who's writing these books that you keep sending me? And they said, אמרו לו, יהודי אחד סמוך לחצריך, מקהל קורדובה, הוא כותב לנו. Right? So there's this Jew that fled from Cordoba, and he has a shop not far. It's like right next to your courtyard. And he's the one who writes us these books. Miad ציווה הסופר והריסו אליו רבי שמואל הלוי. Right? So he ordered them to bring Shemuel HaLevi before them. ואמר לו, אין אתה ראוי לשבת בחנות. He says, you shouldn't be sitting in a shop. You have this great wisdom. אל תסור ממני ימין ושמאל. He says, don't leave my side. I'm hiring you as my advisor. I advise the king, and you're going to advise me. ונעשה סופרו ויועצו. And he became his personal writer, right? So he would record the history of what's going on. He would write poems for him, and he would advise him on all political matters. Right? So he would advise, Rabbi Shmuel HaLevi would advise him, and he would advise the king. And every piece of advice he gave him, he considered it as if it was like the word of God, coming straight from God. And this king Habus, right, this Muslim king of Spain, he succeeded tremendously under his advisor, who was getting all of his advice and input from Rabbi Shmuel. Right, and he did tremendously well. Right, and then this advisor, he eventually became sick, and he was on his deathbed, and he was about to die. And the king came into his chambers in order to visit him, to see him, and he said to him, says, what am I going to do without you? You can't leave me, right? All these wars that are all around me, who's going to guide me through them? והשיב לו, אני לא יעצתיך מליבי מעולם. Says, I never advised you from my own, from my own opinion, from my own thoughts. אלא מלבזה היהודי. All the advice I gave you was from this Jewish guy, who was together with him, I guess in the chambers. Sim einecha alav, like pay attention to him. V'yeh lecha le'av u'chohen. And he should be as like a parent to you, as a father to you, and as a priest. V'chol ma sheyatzecha ken ta'aseh. And everything he advises you to do, just do it. V'Hashem yeh be'ezrecha. And God will be on your side. ולאחר מות הסופר לקח המלך חבוס את רבי שמואל הלוי להיכלו והיה סופר ויועץ. Right, and after this advisor passed away, the king took Rabbi Shmuel Halevi, into his palace and made him his own personal advisor. So now Rabbi Shmuel Halevi, he goes from being a very, very poor, humble merchant to eventually becoming the number one advisor of the king of Spain. And Spain at the time became one of the strongest Muslim outposts in the Muslim world about 1,000 years ago. V'nismach Rav Shmuel Halevi Nagid, and then he was appointed to be a Nagid. Right? Nagid again it's equivalent to the head of the diaspora, or at least locally now in Spain. However, we'll see his influence went out throughout the entire Jewish world. And he was appointed Nagid in the year 4787. Ve'aseh tovot liYisrael b'Sfarad, right? And he did tremendous. He made all the communities benefit, from whatever he has to offer them, and we'll see what that is soon. In Spain, Be'eretz HaMa'arav, right, in the western land. Anybody know what the west Eretz HaMa'arav is? Land of the West? Any ideas?
Europe. Europe.
So we refer to Europe as the West, but don't forget, this is Spain. This is as far west in Europe as you can get. So Eretz HaMa'arav, by the way, in Arabic, is Maghreb. Maghreb, the West, was how we always refer to Morocco. Right, so Eretz HaMa'arav, because that's the westernmost land in North Africa. By the way, back then, everything was called Eretz Ma'arav. Tunis, Algeria, and Morocco was all really one land. It was only later divided up into 3 different countries, much later, right? But back then it was all referred to as the West, right? The Eretz HaMa'arav, so Spain, Morocco, or Morocco, Algeria, and Tunis. Africa being, Libya, and all those areas. Uveres Misraim, right? And so we have like all of North Africa here. Spain, Iskalon, I think is talking about Ashkelon. I'm not sure for sure, but he refers specifically also to Eretz Israel, right? The land of Israel. Ve'ad Yeshivat Bavel, all the way to the Yeshivot in Bavel, Ve'ad Ira Kodesh, and also including Jerusalem. Kol b'nei Torah b'arasot ha'elu haya mehaneh minechasar. Right? Anybody who wants to dedicate himself to study of Torah, he would personally fund them. He would let them benefit from his assets and from his riches. V'niach sefarim harbe mikidvei HaKodesh. והמשנה והתלמוד, שגם הם מכתבי הקודש. Right? And he also wrote a lot of commentaries to the Torah and to the Mishnah and to the Talmud. In fact, one of the more important books we have on how to study Talmud was written by Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid. וכל מי שהיה רוצה להיות תורתו אומנותו, anybody who wanted to dedicate himself to the study of Torah Anywhere in Spain or in these lands that we spoke about, right, who are accessible under the Muslim rule, right? So not really Europe, because there is no connection at this time between Europe, which is Christian, and the rest of the Muslim countries, right? So anybody in these countries, in these lands, wanted to dedicate himself to Torah, he would pay for them, he would fund them. And he also hired scribes. Right? They would write copies of the Mishnah and the Talmud for the students. That they couldn't purchase it on their own, so he would have scribes to write it for them. Remember, this is before there's a print. All copies of the Mishnah and Talmud at this time are handwritten, they're manuscripts, and it's a tremendous collection of works. So he would hire scribes to make copies of the Mishnah and Talmud in order to provide to anyone who is going to dedicate themselves to studying the Mishnah and the Talmud. Ben b'yeshivot Sefarad, anywhere in the yeshivot in Sefarad, ben b'arasot she'izkan, or in Babel, or in Morocco, or in Egypt, or anywhere in North Africa, and in the land of Israel. ועוד היה מספיק שמן זית לבתי כנסיות בירושלים בכל שנה. And he would also provide olive oil to all the synagogues in Jerusalem for an entire year. So every year he would provide them, he would send them tremendous amounts of olive oil, so that they're always able to light up the Batei Knesset. There's always light in the Batei Knesset, so anybody could come and study Torah as much as they like. V'hirbitz Torah harbeh, and he taught a lot of Torah and spread out a lot of Torah study. Umed b'seva tova zaken me'achar shezacha b'dalet kitarim. Right, and he passed away as an old man. He was, healthy. He lived a good life until his old age and passed away. And he attained four crowns. Usually we say there are 3 crowns. So you're familiar with that term? The 3 crowns, Keter Torah, right? Said there's Keter Kehuna. Keter Kehuna is the crown of the priest. It says Zachabo Aharon Ubanav. Aharon merited that crown, and it's for him and his descendants. And there's Keter Malchut, right? The crown of political leadership. Zachabo David Ubanav, right? That was acquired by David and his descendants after him. It says V'cheter Torah arehi munachat bekeren zavit, right? But the crown of Torah knowledge and understanding, that is accessible for anybody. Kol harosei yavo v'yiton. Anybody who wants it is welcome to come, and you have to put in the effort and study Torah and in order to acquire this keter. So he says he acquired 4 ketarim. Keter Torah, right? He had the crown of the Torah because he was one of the greatest scholars at the time. The Keter Gedula, right, which is kind of like the keter of the political leadership. He was very great. He had a lot of influence over even over the Muslim, the Gentile political leadership in Spain, which was one of the biggest and one of the strongest empires at the time. V'cheter Leviya, so he wasn't a Kohen, but he was a Levi. V'cheter Shem Tov u'ma'asim tovim al gabehem. And on top of all that, he had the crown of good deeds and a good name. Right? He was very well respected throughout the entire Jewish community. And he passed away, v'niftar b'shnat daled alafim, that's 816. Sorry, 15. So 4,815. That's the year he passed away, and he was succeeded by his son, Rabbi Yehosef HaLevi Beno HaNagid, right, who we spoke about earlier, who we said at times of Rav Haye Gaon, right, the 2 sons there was Hizkiah Rosh Galut, who succeeded him, right, and became Gaon. Well, not really Gaon after him, but became the head of the yeshiva after him. After he was captured, his two sons fled Babel and came to Spain, right, to be under Rabbi Shimon Hanagid, or under his protection. Excuse me 1 minute. Okay, sorry. So to be under the protection of Rabbi Shimon Hanagid and his son, who succeeded him, Rabbi Yosef Halevi Beno Hanagid. So Rabbi Yosef Halevi Hanagid, who succeeded him, Mikol Midot Tovot Shayu Be'aviv Lo Hasar Lo. Right? He had all of the virtues of his father, except for one thing. Ela shelo haya anvatan ke'aviv. He wasn't humble like his father. His father, if you remember, started off with a very humble beginning. He was very poor. He had a hard time providing for himself and his family. And then he grew, right? And gained a lot of political power through his wisdom and became very, very rich as well. All right. However, his son didn't have this humble beginning like his father. His son was born into a rich family. Right? Because he grew up in a rich environment. And he didn't carry a burden when he was young. I always have my children do a lot of chores around the house, and I always tell them a pasuk of Shlomo HaMelech. I say, Tov lagever she'isa'ol bin urav. Right? It's good for a man to carry a burden when he's growing up, when he's young. So, they're in charge of doing the laundry. They're in charge of taking out the garbage. The little kids, whatever responsibilities I can give them, I give them. And I think it's very important to do so. And they grow up learning to be responsible. But this Rabbi Yosef Hanevi, he grew up in such a rich environment that he never carried a burden. He never had to work hard growing up. And he became very, very arrogant. So he was wise. He was very nice to people. He also is a great benefactor and gave a lot of charity, and he wrote books. However, he became very arrogant, or he grew up very arrogant. Ad sheneherag beyom Shabbat, right? And the other advisors in the king's court became very jealous of him, and they started to hate him until eventually he was murdered. He was murdered. It was on Shabbat, right? This is the date, Tet B'Tevet. The year was 4,824. והוא וקהל גרנטה וכל הבאים מארצות רחוקות לראות תורתו וגדולתו, right? And he had a lot of followers, right? Because he was a great Talmid Chachamim, and he was a very big benefactor, and he was also the leader of the Jewish people at the time. And so they all came to him and they all mourned him. ואבלו הלך בכל מדינה ומדינה וכל עיר ועיר, right? And the sorrow of his death, spread out. Everyone mourned him throughout the Jewish communities. And I was telling an interesting story. Right? We have this thing. It's called Megillat Ta'anit. Megillat Ta'anit is from the times of the Second Temple. The Hachamim then wrote all sorts of days that you're not allowed to mourn on, or that you're supposed to mourn on. For instance, Hanukkah. The source for Hanukkah is from Megillat Ta'anit. How do we know that there's 8 days that we're not allowed to do tahanunan, and we have to light candles. This is all brought in Megillat Ta'anit, and the Talmud, when it institutes the laws of Hanukkah, it quotes Megillat Ta'anit. All right, so we have this Megillat Ta'anit, and it says that on the 9th of Tevet, right, there's a day of mourning. V'lo yadu al mahu, but it doesn't specify why. What's special about this date? Every one of the dates, it says what happened was the Greeks, when the Greeks took over, they said you can't do this anymore. And then when the Hashmonaim overcame them on this day, they renewed that, that thing that the Greeks forbid. And so therefore, on that day, we're not allowed to do Ta'anit. All right? Or on this day, this and this happened, and therefore you have to be in mourning. So it says on the 9th of Tevet, right, there was a date that's specified there, but it doesn't specify what happened. Mikan yadanu shekivenu beruach hakodesh layom hazeh. So he says we know that in the Ruach HaKodesh they were talking about this day that the Rabbi Yosef HaNevi was murdered. Nahar petirato nitpazru sefarav u'Muhammadav u'pashtu b'chol ha'olam. Right, and after he passed away, his books and his writings and his poetry spread out throughout the entire Jewish world. וכן תלמידים שהעמיד הם היו רבני ספרד ומנהיגי הדור אחר פטירתו. And the students of Rabbi Yosef HaLevi HaNagid, right, those students later on became the spiritual leadership of the in Spain, of the Jews in Spain. And they were the leadership, not just Rabbanei Sefarad, not just the rabbis of Spain, but also Manhigei Hador. They were the leadership of that generation after Rabbi Yosef HaLevi passed away. All right, so this is the beginning of this new era, post-Geonic era, right, where the Torah is now slowly transferring, let's say the capital of the Torah is slowly transferring from Babel and moving to Spain, to Cordova. We saw the last of the Geonim, right, was Rav Gaon. After him, he was succeeded by Hizkiah Rosh Galut, who was the head of the diaspora and appointed to be head of the yeshiva after Rav Gaon. However, he no longer carries the title of Gaon, right? Because Rav Gaon, the one before him, was the last of the Geonim. And this is already a time with a lot of turbulence for the Jewish people in Babel, to the point where this Hizkiah Rosh Galut, he was on the one hand head of the diaspora and also head of the court in Babel, was captured by the Muslims, by the Muslim king. He was arrested and tortured, and his sons fled for fear of their lives. They fled, and they went to Spain to this Rabbi Yosef HaLevi, the son of Rabbi Shemuel HaNagid. All right? Who was originally from Cordova. However, due to the wars, they also fled Cordova, and they were in Malaga, and eventually also in Granada. Eventually, we're going to get to the story next week. We'll start with the story of how the yeshivot actually transferred from Babel to Spain, and how Spain, and specifically the yeshiva in Cordova, was established as the new main court, although it doesn't have the same authorities as the yeshivot in Babel. However, the tradition transferred from Babel to the yeshiva in Cordova in Spain. Any questions? Today was
So
more storytelling.
the Geonim was from in the time of the Babel, and that Tanaim is in.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
The Geonim was in Babel and the Tanaim is in Spain. Start from Spain, from Kiskia.
Okay, so the Geonim, there's the Tanaim. You're asking about the Tanaim. The Tanaim or the Hachamim, mostly in Eretz Israel, right? And that period ended with the publication of the Mishnah. The next era following the Mishnah is the Amoraim. There were in Eretz Israel Amoraim, but most of them were in Bavel. We saw even the students, Rav and Shemuel, the students of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who published the Mishnah, they became heads of yeshivot in Bavel. They moved to Bavel. And that era of the Amoraim ends with the publication of the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud. This next era afterwards, there's also the Savoraim, which we mentioned. There's a short period, a few generations of the Savoraim, of the Rashi Yeshivot in Bavel, post-publication of the Talmud. The Savoraim were the ones who had some edits still entered into the Talmud, but the ones after them are the Geonim. And the Geonim also went on for a few generations until Rav Shirira Gaon and his son Rav Haye Gaon, who was the last of the Geonim. And after that, there's still Geonim in Bavel, or some people that are referred to as Geonim, but not really so much anymore. And at this time, the yeshivot in Bavel are kind of losing their power or losing their influence, right? Because of the wars, people can't gather in Bavel anymore as they used to, and there's a lot of persecution now going on in Bavel area, to the point where the successor of the last Gaon, right, was Hizkiah, who was also head of the diaspora and also Rosh Yeshiva, head of the Yeshiva. He was eventually caught by the Muslim ruler over there in Bavel. He was arrested and tortured, and his sons fled from Bavel and went to Spain. They went to Spain to be under the protection of Rabbi Yosef Halevi, the son of Rabbi Shemuel Hanagid, right? So as the Jewish community in Bavel is losing their influence and power, so the yeshivot in Spain are increasing. And this is always something that follows us throughout history, right? When Spain started to dwindle, right? And eventually, I'm talking about already like 1492 with the Spanish Inquisition and the expulsion from Spain. So what started to happen at that time? So a lot of the people who fled Spain or who were banished from Spain, right? They went to Amsterdam, and they founded the New Amsterdam Company, and people like Columbus, and then they went, right? The New Amsterdam Company went and found and started to settle the New World. And what became the next big center of Jewish people eventually, so there was Europe, and then as Europe is going down, New York and America and the New World is going up. So God always leaves like a place for us to go to when the doors are being shut in one area in the world for us. Anything else? Does that answer your question? I kind of went on to.
What is Hiskiyahu called? Tana?
Oh, no. Okay, so this Hizkiah we're talking about over here, right? We're talking about those who succeeded of Gaon, right? Hizkiah Rosh Galut. So first he was Rosh Galut, head of the diaspora. He's like the first one after the Geonim. So you have Tanaim, and then Amoraim, and then Geonim. And then right after the last Gaon, who's Rav Haye Gaon, you have Hizkiah. This is Hizkiah Rosh Galut. He's head of the Galut, and he was also appointed to be head of the Yeshiva in Bavel.
Toda.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Sami, Saadia Gaon is not part of the Geonim period, and yet he's called Gaon.
Rabbi Saadia Gaon, yeah, he is one of the Geonim. He's one of the he's also one of the more famous and prominent.
Vilna. I'm referring to Vilna Gaon.
Oh, Vilna Gaon, right. Vilna Gaon is much later. This we're already talking about. Vilna Gaon was what, a few hundred years ago. Like he's not even one of the Rishonim. He's probably more part of the Acharonim. He's one of the later generations.
So Geonim is different to Gaon, right?
Right. So Geonim as a title is in this era, ends about 1,000 years ago. After that, there are no more Geonim. Vilna Gaon is kind of they gave him the title of Gaon, but he's not part of the Geonim. It's like saying the wise, the intelligent, the genius. By the way, the reason why they were called Geonim, the original Geonim, why were they called Geonim? They were Rosh Yeshivat Gaon Yaakov. Right, they were the heads of the yeshiva named Gaon Yaakov. And so they call Rav Saadia Gaon. Gaon is Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, Gaon Yaakov. So to answer your question in one word, no, Vilna Gaon is not part of these Geonim. They just added the term Gaon to his name as out of respect and to the Rav Vilna Gaon. But there's no connection between that and the Geonim like Rav Saadia Gaon, Rav Shira Gaon, Rav Haye Gaon. Anything else? Okay, so next week we're gonna discuss this great story, Arbat Shvuim, right? The four captives and the rise of Yeshivat Cordoba. We may possibly finish next week this course. If not, it'll be after the vacation. We'll have another session or maybe two, and that'll be the end of this course of the introduction to the oral Torah. And then we have to think of something else to study. Open to suggestions.
Maybe you can give us assignment.
Maybe Mishnah.
Mishnah.
We already passed.
I'll also discuss with Bracha. So if you have any requests, speak to Bracha and we'll discuss it.
Okay.
Okay, excellent.